So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, if you're in residential solar or installing batteries, there's big changes going on. The solar residential and battery tax credit, which is Section 25D, sunsetted, ended on December 31st, 2025. Actually, let me restate, it didn't sunset. It was actually killed by the current presidential administration. But now there's more demand than ever for commercial ownership structures such as PPAs and leases that can allow residential customers to put solar on and still get the benefits of the tax credits. But we're kind of grappling with all those changes. In addition, there are equipment shortages because a lot of these tax credits depend on having equipment that's made in the United States. And we're also kind of still swimming a little bit upstream because there's a federal government disdain for solar and batteries and sometimes in clean energy in general. So it's kind of the drill baby drill attitude, and solar and batteries are suffering. So we all knew that 2026 was going to be really tough. Fortunately, these new solar financing products can restore the tax credit benefits to homeowners. They're complicated, but they work. There's an extreme demand for more electricity on the grid because of data centers, as well as just the normal growth we've been expecting with heat pumps and with EVs. States are kind of kicking in their efforts to encourage solar and batteries more. And so there are a lot of bright spots, and hopefully these bright spots can outshine the clouds that we're grappling with. When I think about who has the best overall concept of what's going on in the solar industry, I just always look towards the Solar Energy Industries Association. And to that end, our guest today is Sean Gallagher, who is the Senior VP of Policy at SEIA. When it comes to residential policy, boy, Sean goes way back to his work at the California Public Utilities Commission when the California Solar Initiative was just getting started. He's got firsthand knowledge of incentives, tax credits, financing options, and rebate programs throughout the United States. And I worked together with Sean on the SEIA board many years ago when we successfully implemented the solar investment tax credit and got that restored. So Sean comes from a background of residential solar, and now he's SEIA's overall Senior VP of Policy. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Barry. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, good. So let's kind of dive in. We're only about 2 months into 2026. How's the residential industry doing so far this year?
Yeah, it's sort of a tale of two cities in some ways, Barry. As you sort of noted, at the end of 2025, a lot of companies in the residential sector were going gangbusters trying to get projects in before the end of the 25D tax credit. So a lot of busy companies, and in some cases, sales that couldn't get completed because of the equipment shortages that you mentioned. But people were busy in 25. I think first part of this year, what we are hearing is that things are a lot tougher, things are a lot slower. We've got some market data coming out on March 10th in about a week and a half. But our report, we put out these quarterly market reports. This only goes through Q4 of 2025. And it's going to show that overall, for 25, the residential sector was about flat compared to 2024. And that reflects the first half of the year where there was a lot of uncertainty around tariffs and around, remember the Liberation Day tariffs were on again, off again, on again, off again. There was a lot of uncertainty about what was going to be in the federal legislation. And so the market was kind of locked up for a while in the first half of last year. And then there was the sort of surge in demand after the bill passed to get in before the deadline. And the result was a year that was about flat. This year, we expect there to be some contraction in the residential market. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. And with growth sort of picking up again next year, and getting back to 2024 levels in 2 or 3 years out.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what we're seeing. When I talk to my friends in the industry, is things are starting off slower, much slower than normal. There was a big demand pull in over the
Right.
end of 2025, and we had a record year. And now it's really slow, and we're gearing up to use these new financing tools. It takes a little bit of time, but I'm sure it'll be fine. And luckily, the utilities continue to raise electric rates. Luckily, from the standpoint of our industry, it's a really really good alternative for that. And so I
Right.
think by the time the summer rolls around, we'll be doing pretty well, maybe not at the levels exactly of the same time 2025, but everybody's going to be doing pretty well as long as they can get the equipment that they need. Let's talk a little bit about tax credits. Boy, SEIA fought really hard to preserve those tax credits. I remember reading all the articles, and they're in, they're out, they're in, they're out, and they managed to keep the commercial credits for a few more years, but lose the residential credits. Now that the residential credits are gone, tell us a little bit about the financing options that make the most sense for residential installers. And then after we talk about them conceptually, let's talk about how that's working out for the installers and what they can do to take maximum advantage of the third party ownership structures.
Yeah, sure. And one of the things that we've been focused on since the bill passed 4th of July last year is, trying to help the residential sector figure out how to manage this transition, right? What's the residential sector need? How can we be helpful? And so one of the things we've done is we put out this financing guide for residential installers, which I hope we can somehow get to your audience after the show. And so that guide goes through the various financing options that are available, including third-party ownership options, but also loan products and of various kinds, right? You've got the sort of the big solar loan companies, which some of them still exist, not all of them. And so bank loans, home equity credit loans, and then some detail around PPAs and leases. We're hearing a lot of interest, of course, among installers about using the third-party ownership model, sometimes for the first time, right? So there's a lot of businesses that were able to make cash sales before and use a 25D credit. They're looking into how to get into TPO in order to access that 48E credit. And I think that based on what we're hearing, leases are probably the most common, right? So when you talk about third-party ownership, typically mean either leases or PPAs. Leases, I think, are more common for the most part, and leases are typically available in most, if not every state, while PPAs are not always available in every state. We're also seeing an uptick in interest in PPAs, including, I'm sure you've seen this, there's some new entrants offering prepaid PPAs that try to replicate the ownership experience. The customer ends up with ownership of the system sooner, sometimes as soon as 5 years after the installation. Oh, by the way, you sometimes hear the phrase prepaid leases, but my understanding is that prepaid leases generally not available. You run into some tax law issues if you try to do a prepaid lease. It looks like it's an actual sale, and you get some real complications. So stay away from those. And then there's also a rise of sort of low cost solar loans from both traditional banks and some of the new climate banks. We had a webinar a few weeks ago where one of the new climate banks was on, and their loans are funded by deposits, so their cost of capital is lower than some of the traditional solar lenders, and it can look more like a home equity loan or a traditional line of credit type loan. I guess the last thing I'll say, Barry, before you jump in again is, the 40E tax credit also expires at the end of 2027 as things now stand. So in addition to sort of trying to figure out how to use these tax or these financing options, installers have to be thinking about what happens after that. And so another focus for us is trying to help with sort of cost down issues. And I hope we can talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. And our perspective when we started to see what was happening, what was going to happen in 2026 when the tax credits were canceled, well, first of all, priority number one was to double down and do as much business as we could in 2025 to give us the longest possible runway. And then towards the end of 2025, we started looking at the various financing options. And on the one hand, we say, well, maybe we can continue to use credit unions, which we've always used, and they're relatively low interest rates. It's a neighborhood kind of thing, but the customers weren't able to monetize the tax credit. We also thought about using really inexpensive equipment. But then the dilemma there is we couldn't always get made in the USA equipment. Reliability wasn't always there. For modules and inverters, low cost equipment is okay, but our experience with kind of finding a really cheap battery means that you might not get the reliability that you'd like. So we kind of didn't really have good options. And then, when 2026 started, we just very quickly just signed up for one of the prepaid financing. And I do. There's kind of a differences between prepaid lease and prepaid PPAs. The one that we're using is kind of, they actually call it synthetic cash. So we don't use the L word. We don't use the lease. And I don't know if, and it's not since it's prepaid, there's no ongoing payment, whether it's payment based on production or payment based on a fixed amount. So it's very clean. It's very easy to explain to customers. You pay 70% of the equipment of the cost of the normal cash price up front, and then you're kind of done. And the finance company handles the tax credit, and they're able to make money on that. So that's working. But I'd love to talk to you and these things are available to all installers depending on their sizes, and right. they do work. But the things that we're realizing, and we really were evaluating this pretty carefully, is what are the hooks? What are the extra things you have to do? So let's talk about some of those, because it sounds like the money's great and it's a really good solution, but it has a big operational impact both on your company and what you're doing, and also it has a cash flow impact.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, because, and in particular, it's all the more important to understand exactly who your TPO is, and what their business practices are, how it's going to work for you, because there's a lot of new entrants, right, that don't have the track record that some of the longer term, vertically integrated TPOs have. You probably have a pretty good sense of how Sunrun's going to operate, for example. Going to do business with them, but some of these new entrants, they're more like intermediaries. They're not vertically integrated. That gives you a lot more options, but you also have to to really ask some good questions to make sure that you understand what you're dealing with. And so one of the things that our Resi financing guide does is it provides a list of questions for installers to ask of third-party owners, their TPO offerers, before you get into a deal with them. And so, for example, how often are you going to pay me? When am I going to get paid? What's your background in this market? What kind of appraisals do you use? Do you put limits on fair market value? So because if the TPO is a little bit too fast to list with FMV, you can create risk that you weren't anticipating. So I think that's one of the things that installers who haven't worked with TPO before, really have to be attuned to, is make sure you understand, really carefully who the TPO provider is, what their business practices are, whether anything about the way they do business creates risk, and make sure you understand it, because some risks are going to be worth taking, some aren't. And then, some of the practical stuff. When am I going to get paid? Do you provide any working capital? Some TPOs will. That can be helpful.
Yeah, those are exactly the issues that we started engaging with in the fourth quarter of 2025, and started signing things at the beginning of 2026. And what ended up happening is something that we refer to as the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. And so it's especially when there's so much of a demand for these financing products, whether it's prepaid or not, there's very little flexibility that installers have. It's basically whatever platform you're dealing with, because understandably, these financing companies, they have investors who have their own requirements. So the financing companies have to pass through the investor requirements, and they could be pretty difficult and pretty rigid. So, but all of the questions you're asking about are important. I mean, we're drilling down, and we have to make sure that our operational system can do the serial number tracking we need to do, have pictures of the installed equipment, make sure that everything's done perfectly, that it's actually safe harbor equipment, even to the point of making sure that the commodity aluminum rails are commodity aluminum rails that came from the U.S. instead of Canada, for
Hmm.
heaven forbid. So it's tricky. Let's talk a little bit about what the biggest hazard to installers is working with an outside financing company is cash flow. What's some advice that you have for installers related to their cash flow using these products?
Well, right, a couple of things, right? Some of these providers will offer working capital to installers so that you are able to sort of go out and sell the next job while you're installing the first job. That can be really beneficial. I think there's other financing options that can provide similar kinds of options, right? Some of the distributors, for example, will also offer either financing products or warehousing services or other services that can sort of help the installer manage its cash flow, and that can be really useful also. One of the things about the new TPO providers that's interesting is that with this rise of the intermediary TPO provider, they're not necessarily focused in the same way that the vertically integrated TPOs were on volume. And so I think one of the things we're seeing, at least with some of these entities, is a sort of new effort um, on controlling costs, right? So having some principles around how much the TPO will pay for the asset that the installer installs, which is going to sort of encourage price discipline from the installer, sort of potentially maybe reduce some of the incentives for poor sales practices, right, which we've seen in our market. Yeah, so I mean, that's one of the reasons I think we're excited about this is that we could see some beneficial results coming from the use of some of these new products.
When you talk about some of these financing products having a 50% platform fee, so you can have solar bros making $1 million a year by selling like crazy, and that's kind of scary for long-term viability of the industry. It gives us a bad name. So I'm a big fan of making sure there's constraints about bad practices and making sure we're doing things the right way and not pissing off too many people. But that's some activity that SEIA, and I know CalSA has been very engaged with on a state-by-state basis.
Yeah, we've been really engaged on consumer protection in a number of states over the last several years in support of well-written consumer protection legislation that actually does protect customers, but also allows companies to do business, right? So there's a little bit of a fine line there you have to hit. And some of our member companies have expressed concern that pieces of legislation could go too far and create restrictions that make life difficult for the installer, but don't necessarily improve the customer experience. So that's the balance that we're trying to strike, is really provide some good consumer protection provisions while allowing the company to do business.
Yeah.
Their bill just got out of the Massachusetts House the other day. I think does a pretty good job of doing that.
Yeah, we in California have had for the past, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, a 26-page consumer protection guide that nobody ever read. In 2026, that 26-page guide, I think, has been pared down to 7 pages, which is really good. And now it requires us to kind of put in a lot of manual information that's not easily accessible from the various systems. But it's a good step. I think at the end of the day, though, you're still getting companies that are just going to kind of ignore the rules, break the rules, and sell like crazy. And it almost reminds me of the car sales business, where
Yeah.
you might negotiate a price with your sales guy, in a new car dealership, and then you have to meet with the financing guy. And the financing guy is I think
Worst
there to
part of the
follow all the
experience.
rules. And the last vehicle I bought after I negotiated the price, it happens every single time I buy a vehicle, brand new vehicle. I have a price. It's arranged. I go in, and the financing guy at these national, well-known companies basically just lie to throw another few $1,000s onto the account. So I'm almost a little bit skeptical that there's anything that we can do to rein that in, other than just making sure that people who are looking for systems work with reputable companies.
Yeah, and there's also, I mean, I think there are some things we can do, Barry. And one of them is customer education, right? So SEIA's got residential customer guides, the questions customers should ask of their installers too, right? Things customers should be aware of. We've got residential disclosure forms that companies can use and that customers can demand, which try to put the various offers customers will see from different installers, on a level playing field so they can compare effectively. But you're right. I mean, I think one of the things that we need to correct is the incentives, right? And if the incentives are such that to encourage poor behavior is going to happen, and a few bad apples can give the whole industry a bad name, right? I think by and large, most of our member companies have gotten the message that in order to have sustainable long-term business, we've got to do things the right way. But it doesn't take many instances of poor behavior to create some real problems.
My advice to consumers, whether it's in our territory here in Silicon Valley or anywhere around the country, is it's really hard to figure that out. There's all this paperwork, there's all these rules. The most important thing is getting referrals and working with a solar and battery company that's been doing this for a long time and has a good reputation. And they're not going to have 100% perfect reviews. There's going to be some good and bad, but the companies that have been around have done so by operating effectively and ethically for 5, 10, 20, 25 years. And that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
With the federal government opposed to clean energy, kind of in general, maybe some exceptions here and there, let's talk a little bit about what the states are doing, because it really seems to be like a state business now, where it's much, much easier to put good policies in effect in states that are going to effectively reduce the cost for systems.
Yeah, it's a good point. And like I think many organizations, we have really redoubled our focus on the states for 2026, recognizing, as you said, that we've got a hostile federal government. We're not going to get policy support from the federal government anytime soon, so we've got to look for that in the support that support in the states. I'm going to tout another one of our products here for a second, if you'll let me. We put out a post HR1 state policy roadmap. SEIA did after the bill passed last summer, and it's heavy on things that states can do to speed deployment of solar and battery storage. Without a lot of state spending, right? Because a lot of states also got hit with Medicaid reductions and other reductions in that bill. And so what can the states do in particular? What can states do broadly, but what can states do in particular without spending a ton of dough? And it's things like interconnection streamlining, enabling flexible interconnection, right? So use the hosting capacity that's available without requiring upgrades every time you want to put a new system on the line. Accelerating permitting, and for residential permitting, particularly through automated permitting platforms like Solar App and like Symbian, which have both been, I think, really good. And we're seeing automated permitting legislation being pursued in a number of states this year. We want to ensure that we want to enable the full capabilities of solar and energy storage systems, both to support the grid and to provide value to customers, right? And so that means things like virtual power plant programs, which I like the distributed power plant program, right? DPP rather than VPP, because they're not virtual, they're real, they're just distributed. So I'm trying to adopt that lingo, the DPP lingo. And they aggregate lots of homes and businesses and it can effectively operate as a power plant. That's good for the utility, it's good for customers. And the other thing we're encouraging states to do is accelerate clean energy procurement while the tax credits remain available. And so we saw California do that for utility scale solar, I think just this week, but they can also do that with things like VPPs or DPPs to encourage deployment while those tax credits are available.
I'm kind of a love-hate relationship with VPPs or DPPs because I think that they make a terrific amount of sense.
Yeah.
The challenge is the economics for customers can vary widely depending on the design of the program. California has had a great program. We're trying to reinitialize it called the TSGS program.
Yeah.
Terrific. But, I see other companies that are out there that are really kind of cheating the customers because the customers really don't know what the value streams are and they could end up paying for this. And so you've got a DPP acronym. I like to make a distinction between distributed energy resources, DERs, which we talk about. But the thing to remember about I like it, DPPs, it's really a customer energy resource. The customers bought that thing. They've got to maintain it. They've paid for it. And so have to give respect to the customers to kind of not rip them off, because a lot of the economics of these things are completely opaque. And the other thing that I noticed is VPPs have become a standard feature on all of the third-party ownership systems that I've seen. And because it's an additional cash flow for the TPO provider and the investor, and if it's designed fairly and ethically, it's also an additional cash flow benefit to the homeowner. And
Yeah,
that's really, really important. I always like to see that that's kind of built in.
I agree with you. And it really does. The details do matter, right? In order for these programs, frankly, to be successful, they've got to provide value to the customer, to the homeowner, um, and they've got to provide some value to the grid as well, right? And that's the potential sweet spot that we can hit if we do this thing, if we do these things correctly. Um, and particularly in places like California where we've got wildfires, having the battery storage is, you know, it's maybe hard to quantify that resilience value, but it's really there. And I think we've seen battery storage attachments rates in California as high as like 75% the last couple of years, because people are seeing the need for it.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, you've got to design these programs in the right way, and they've got to provide value to everybody to make sense.
Yeah, with the net billing tariff, AKA net metering 3, we're
Yeah,
over 95% as far as our attachment rate.
is that
Everybody
right?
gets a battery. It's not just the people who have a lot of blackouts. It's basically anybody putting in solar, because they don't want to get credited for 2 or 3 cents for their power that they send back
Yeah,
to the grid during the day. So
right.
that works well. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is for other states to adopt streamlined permitting like SolarApp and like Symbian. We've gotten to the point right now where we're selling in Silicon Valley, and there's most of the cities in our area are using Symbian or SolarApp, or San Jose has automated permitting for 10 years. But the ones that don't, I mean, our costs are much higher. Our timeframes are much higher.
Hmm.
And when we were going into the end of 2025, we were only marketing and selling in jurisdictions that had these services, because we couldn't wait for the time it
Hmm.
took to get the
Makes
permit,
sense.
the uncertainty. So that worked out really, really well. And I'm such a solar optimist that I'm still holding out hope that we can kind of eliminate some interconnection requirements. But that's something that's pretty stubborn. And when it comes to interconnection requirements, that kind of raises the next topic that I'd love to talk to you about, get your insights on, is this concept of balcony solar or plug-in solar. What do you see as the potential for that, and how could that kind of work out?
Boy, there's lots of news around plug-in solar these days, isn't there? If you read the trade press,
Yep.
every other day there's an article about plug-in solar. I think officially, so we've obviously been thinking about this a lot, or maybe it's not so obvious, but we've been thinking about this a lot. Officially, our position is generally supportive of plug-in solar, and plug-in solar and storage, because they're both, as long as there's some safety provisions and assurances, right? So, and we talked about consumer protection issues. The last thing that our industry needs is for plug-in solar to be creating new safety issues for customers. So that's the one thing that we're going to be pretty firm on in terms of offering our support for legislation that enables plug-in solar. But and people people talk a lot about lower solar costs in Australia, right, and Germany, and there's lots of institutional reasons why here in the U.S. it's going to be hard to get all the way down to those kinds of numbers. But one of the most insightful things that I heard recently was at RE Plus last year. Someone said uh, solar has to be sold in America, right? That's why we've got door-to-door salesmen and all that. But in Australia, largely because the price is so low, solar's bought. And so how are we going to get to a situation here in the US where solar is just bought and we don't have to work quite so hard on selling it? And that's one of the reasons I'm enthusiastic about plug-in solar. Germany shows there's a large market. They've had 4 million installations, I think, in just a few years. Um, and I think that, and maybe this is going to be both sort of good news and bad news for installers. I think that plug-in solar has the potential to put some downward price pressure on traditional resi installations, right? Because plug-in solar is going to be pretty cheap. And if that's true, that could create some, that could be painful for installers in the near term. But if it helps us over a longer term get our structural costs down, that's going to be really beneficial for our industry as a whole over the long term.
Yeah, yeah. I've spent a lot of time like you looking at plug-in solar and it's working with the environmental working group on the build that's going on in California, and I'm familiar with what happened in Utah. I talked to all the other companies that have the products. I kind of have three comments, and they're all things that you touched on. I look at plug-in solar as a gateway drug. I
Yeah,
don't think
yeah,
it's somebody that's got a
that's
$400
another good point.
monthly electric bill. They're not going to bring it down to $300 with plug-in solar. It's you really need a solar system. I don't see a lot of competition ever happening between the rooftop solar industry with batteries and plug-in solar. The place where I think it's going to make the biggest impact is if we're able to get plug-in solar to simplify the interconnection or have no interconnection
Hmm.
requirement at all. I mean, gee,
Right.
for a 400 watt solar panel that might be putting out 300 watts in perfect conditions, and the house is using 200 watts, you're sending like a lousy 100 watts back to the grid. That's not gonna, it's almost impossible to affect anything. Even if every single house in the neighborhood was sending 100 watts back to the grid because they've got balconies, it's not going to matter. So the trick is really to make sure that with plug-in solar, and what's going to enable it is automatic interconnection. If it's on, with a certain design of system, 400 watts, I think Germany's 800 watts, you don't need any interconnection costs at all. That would be great. And I think that would start giving our industry an ability to reduce interconnection complications for rooftop systems.
I think even the Utah legislation allows systems up to 1200 watts, I think, for
Yes.
plug-in
Yep.
with no interconnection requirements, which it's a good foundation. And I think at least some of the products that are available even today will have built-in software that will prevent the product from discharging to the grid if the plug-in system is producing more than the home's consuming. So I think you can even avoid that and avoid that whole slew of issues that comes with it.
There's a lot of safety features that are built in, and I totally agree with you. In Germany, I believe they're allowing 800 watt systems. It doesn't matter. 1200 watts is fine. There are really significant, not very common, but theoretical safety issues, and maybe more than theoretical, it could happen where you're overloading a circuit. So I know in the
Yeah,
U.S. we are looking at making changes to the UL requirements for something that plugs in to make
right.
sure that it's done in a way that's not going to result in a shock to the user, and B, overheating one of the wires between the circuit
Absolutely.
breaker and the plug-in.
Really
So that's
important.
going to get done, and I think those two things are we can work on a legislation that's going to open up the interconnection. And it's going to take a year, maybe longer, to get the UL stuff figured out with a special plug that you use, maybe with some software. You mentioned one other thing that's kind of near and dear to my heart, which was, the big cost differences between the United States and, I kind of looked at some average numbers. It's $5.50 a watt for a rooftop solar system with a battery. Australia, and I convinced my wife to go on vacation to Australia last month. And while I was there, I spent 4 days working with with other companies in Australia. And the costs before incentives are $2.04 for solar and batteries in Australia. And I kind of go into the details, but what do you think the federal government can do? Not right now, but maybe in 2029, to really reduce some of those costs that are being caused by tariffs, regulations, things like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. And, one of the things I think that differs about the US and Australia is that you've got a sort of nationalized regime in Australia in some ways, which we're never going to replicate here. So I think I said something about institutional barriers earlier, and that's kind of what I was alluding to. There are some things the federal government can do. I think in the near term, the first thing we're looking for is clear and workable FIAC rules, right? I think most people are sort of assuming that we're going to get rules that we can deal with. And the guidance that we saw a couple of weeks ago, as far as it went, was pretty workable, but it doesn't answer some of the critical questions about like what's going to count as effective control and how much foreign financing is acceptable, those sorts of things. So we're waiting for more guidance from the feds on that. A little further out, there are some things that the federal government could do and might do, particularly if you're looking beyond 2028. I think one key thing is to continue to support domestic manufacturing and extend support for domestic manufacturing and help domestic manufacturing reach scale. So we don't have as much supply chain risk from internationally with tariffs and everything else. And stabilizing and eventually reducing tariffs on components. Another key thing that the federal government can do. And again, I don't think that's going to be something that's going to happen in the near term, but it's something that could happen, particularly in the next administration. Of course, the next Congress could look into reinstating the 25D tax credit. I don't think that's off the table. There are lots of Democrats in the Congress now that are interested in just sort of deleting the language in last year's bill and reinstating the language from the IRA. So we'll see where that goes and how the industry feels about it. I mean, there are at least some of our member companies who don't want to be subject to that kind of policy risk and are thinking about maybe we'd be better off without tax credits going forward. I don't want to suggest that view is universal, but there's certainly some people trying to think about that right now. So there are some useful things the federal government can do. I think, though, if you look at things like the Tesla cost down white paper, which I'm sure you've seen, they're not really looking to the federal government for that much. They are looking to the federal government for things like tariffs and domestic manufacturing support, but they're looking at things like that we've already been talking about: permitting, interconnection, eliminating some codes and standards barriers on the ability to use the full rooftop, for example, and then installer efficiencies, things that I think you and who was also on the webinar that we did with you a few weeks ago was talking about sort of process efficiencies and just making your business work a little bit more effectively and not leaving money on the table that way.
Yeah. Tesla's done a terrific job, and it's really from a product design standpoint of minimizing the work, and a few other solar and battery companies that are doing something similar, where they just instead of unpacking 7 boxes of all these components and wiring them together, you only have to unpack 1 or 2, and that really saves time and really improves reliability.
There are other manufacturers that are trying to do the same kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Enphase told us their product now used to be 7 things, and now it's 3 things.
Yep, and then we're big fan of Enphase. That's working well, and Franklin's doing something similar to Tesla. They have some extra features. Once you figure out how to move a 300 or 400 pound battery, you don't have to unpack 4 boxes, and then it really saves a lot of installation time. One of the things, and this I'm just thinking back to 10 or 15 years when I was working on the SEIA board, the satellite dish business managed to get a law through the FCC where basically it said that any satellite dish of a certain size could always be installed without any local code restrictions. And that basically just made dish networks and everybody else kind of take off. You see these dishes pop up everywhere. In my wildest dreams, that would be great if we can get something like that from the energy department or the FCC. So we'll see how that works out. But there are things the federal government can do. And when I was meeting with the Australian installers, I'm like, that. Tariffs? They don't have any tariffs. They just put all the parts on a boat, comes from Shanghai right into Sydney, and the modules, the rails, the inverters, the batteries, it just comes right through very fast. And they're not trying to build that domestic manufacturing business because they realize that they're going to get so many more economic benefits if every building has solar on it. So we're not quite there yet in the US as far as that kind of attitude.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to get there in the near term, Barry. There's just so much antipathy towards China now, and particularly in the Congress on both sides of the aisle, and not just from economics, but from a energy security, a national security perspective, right? You've heard concerns, and whether they're realistic or not, they exist, right? So, can China turn off all of our inverters? Those kinds of things that. I don't think are realistic, but I think you're going to see, and one of the reasons that SEIA has been so focused on domestic manufacturing since 2018 or 19, whatever it was, is sort of recognizing that that's the mood of the Congress, and in order to secure the policy support that we need to move the industry forward over the long term, we need to have a manufacturing base here, so that we can. So we've got domestic manufacturers that support us, and that we're not subject completely to all the supply chain and trade and tariff risk.
I'm a big fan of the domestic solar module manufacturing business, and but what's happened is that business depends on having inexpensive components, and it's not until you have inexpensive components that you're going to
Yeah,
build the manufacturing. Once you have the manufacturing, then you can kind of start backward integrating into making
right. And that's
the
starting.
cells and the
Yeah.
wafers and the silicon, and that's it's starting and it's stopping. And I think right now the game is more on the battery side. And once
Hmm.
again, we're starting and then we're stopping. And meanwhile, there's a lot of confusion on that. But the potential is there because I look at this really mostly as a battery business with the commoditized solar kind of tagging on.
Particularly in California, right?
Yep.
And one of the things we're hearing on the battery side is that, with the removal of the EV incentives, there's a bunch of factories here in the US that we're going to that we're going to build EV batteries that are now switching to providing battery energy storage.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's going to help with, availability of fiat compliant batteries over the next several years, which we were pretty worried about a year
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Ford did a $19 billion write-off getting out of
Right.
the electric vehicle business. Stop making the Lightning, which is, we have two of those. We use them for our workers and they're terrific,
Huh.
but now they're going to be using it for stationary batteries, and that would be great. Kind of the final thing to talk about, because it's probably in the news even more than balcony and plug-in solar, is data center affordability. What can the solar industry do to try and find a way to add the capacity and the energy that all these new data centers are going to need without building utility power plants and transmission lines, which is going to be rate based and will definitely, without a doubt, increase everybody's rates?
As you note, the data centers it's going crazy. Energy demand skyrocketing, largely, but not entirely as a result of that. So, I mean, one way that solar and storage help contain the cost pressures that data centers and demand growth generally provides is simply by adding supply, right? So add more supply. If demand's going up and supply's not going up, prices are going up, right? That's econ 101. And so you've got to keep adding supply. And what's the most affordable and most available supply in the US today? It's solar and battery storage. 79% of all the new capacity brought online last year in the US was solar and battery storage. 80 something percent of all the most advanced things in interconnection queues across the country are solar and energy storage. If you go to NERC, which is the National Energy Reliability Regulator, they'll tell you they expect 80%, maybe 85% of all the new resources coming online in the next 5 years to be solar and energy battery storage. And that's because, for one thing, gas turbines aren't available, right? If you're a data center or you're a utility, you want to build a new gas power plant, you can't unless you've already ordered the gas turbine some years ago, because they're just not available until 5 to 7 years out. So the most fundamental way that solar and storage are going to help control costs is by providing new supply, right? And that means all solar, whether it's residential solar that frees up space on the transmission system and distribution system, or utility scale solar, commercial solar, community solar, you name it. Adding supply is the name of the game over the next few years, and solar and energy storage is what can do that. But batteries can help data centers in lots of other ways too. And data centers are using batteries today, and there's a large demand for batteries among data centers, right? To provide backup power, to ride through grid disturbances, to provide demand flexibility, right? You've heard a lot about data centers have to bring their own power, or at least have some flexible demand. Tyler Norris, who's at Google now, has written a couple of papers on that. If you get, I don't know what it is, like a couple of percent of flexibility from data centers throughout the course of the year, you can, save large amounts of money by reducing peak and by reducing instances of peak. So there's a lot that batteries in particular can do for these data centers, and solar can too. Like I was at a groundbreaking or not ribbon cutting not long ago in Texas for a 900 megawatt solar facility that's going to power a Google data center. So, there's lots of opportunities.
Yeah, yeah, and that'll take off. The numbers are very compelling when it comes to the cost of solar compared to natural gas and long distance transmission lines,
Really
and the
compelling.
speed at which it can be installed. It's just 2 years versus 10 years. So
That's right. Speed to power is the key thing here for the data center guys. And what's speed to power these days? It's us, right?
yeah, well, there's a statistic that CalSA had. It was done by Richard McCann, and over the past 15 years, the peak demand in California was expected to go up by 15 gigawatts. That was the expectation by 2023, and it turned
It's
out not
huge.
to go up at all. It didn't go up at all.
Because of the
And then you kind of met, and Richard said, "Hey, we put in 15 gigawatts of rooftop solar, and that matched it perfectly." And so it really does work. It's all of the above, and and some of these data centers are going to need natural gas. I hate to see it, but that's okay. But I just hate it when certain very realistic segments like solar are kind of or wind are picked out as ones that are bad for some reason. So it's all of the above. Getting close to wrapping up. I was just really curious. It was interesting to see that you were at the CPUC back in the California Solar Initiative days. But how did you get into energy, and how did you get into solar?
how to get into energy. I'm a recovering lawyer, Barry. I took an energy law and policy class my last semester of law school at Berkeley, and decided that's what I wanted to do. After I got a job at the California PUC as a lawyer, and after several years, they asked me to take over the energy division. So, 2005, I took over the energy division at the PUC here in San Francisco.
That was with Gray Davis, right? Maybe it was.
I think it was right. I think that's when Arnold came in,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Yep.
And there was the Million Solar Roofs Initiative, which I think failed in the legislature its first time around.
I was I got out yelled by Scott Wetch
I got yelled at by
during
Steve
that.
Peace.
Yep.
Yeah.
So but then we got it the next year.
Right. Well, in the meantime, Mike Peavy told the commission to develop its own initiative, and that was the initial genesis of the California Solar Initiative. I took over a team that was putting that together with a lot of outside stakeholder help. And then, those were also the early days of the California Renewable Portfolio Standard. We were coming out of the energy crisis from 2000 and 2001. And in the early days of the RPS in California, all the RPS was wind, right? Because wind was more commercially advanced than solar. And, the demand profile in California, looks at the bell curve, right? It looks like that. But the wind generation profile looks like this. Winds in the evening and sort of dips during the day. So when I decided it was time to leave the commission, time for me to leave the commission, I thought, well, we're going to need some solar in this renewable portfolio standard to match up with that wind. And so I went to look for work in the solar industry and worked for some developers for quite a while. And then I moved over to SEIA sometime later.
Well, it's really great to have been able to work with you for many, many years at SEIA, both on the residential side and now on the overall policy side. So SEIA is doing great work. We need more than we ever can. How can people get in touch with you?
It's pretty easy to find me. My email address on the website, Sean S. Gallagher at SEIA.org, or call me up. And I actually have the pleasure of living in California. I spent a lot of time in DC, but so spent a lot of time going back and forth. But yeah, love to hear from people.
That's all the time we have on this week's Energy Show. And Sean, thank you so much for joining me and kind of talking about some of these national solar issues. Thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. And if you missed any of today's show, you can always go to our website at energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's Energy Show.